So you guys are sixth formers, right? That's the understanding I have here, right? And this is a capstone class. Okay. Does somebody want to describe for me what this class is about? Anyone? You go ahead.
It's sort of kind of connecting science and us. They took a variety of different angles from PTSD, which we talked about on Friday,
Okay.
to environmental stuff, so it's like all around.
Okay, okay. So, yeah, so that's good to know. So I am a psychiatrist, as Mrs. Bean said, and you know, I graduated from here in 1990, and I thought what I'd do is maybe talk a little bit about, you know, who I am and how I kind of got to this particular place in my life, and then talk a little about the work that I do, which I'm both a psychiatrist, but I'm also a neuroscientist. So I study the brain, and I study behavior, and I study psychiatric disorders from the perspective of the brain. So things like PTSD and anxiety disorders, depression. My particular area is addiction, and so I can talk a little bit about some of the research I've done in that area, and you know, hopefully it will be of interest to you. I'll maybe even tie in a little bit about what you guys learned about PTSD and traumatic brain injury and things like that too. So after I graduated here in 1990, I took Mrs. Bean's brain class, which was really actually a kind of a revolutionary class in many ways, but especially for me, and then it got me interested in neuroscience. This was an area that was kind of burgeoning at that time, and she really had the vision to sort of see that as an important thing to teach young people, because it's a subject that is actually relevant for your everyday life. You know, it's hopefully obvious to most of you here that every thought, every feeling, every behavior that you have is tied to something going on here in this physical brain that you have, right? So, and it gets also into very interesting questions about the mind and body and how they're connected, and the soul, and all sorts of interesting, potentially spiritual and philosophical questions that we'll leave aside today, but just suffice it to say that there's all sorts of interesting stuff that neuroscience can teach you and can make you curious about. And so I started off, so after I graduated from Canterbury, I went to NYU, where they had one of the first undergraduate neuroscience majors. And again, it was because of my exposure in high school that I decided that was something that I wanted to study. So I went there, majored in neuroscience, did a minor in Near Eastern languages and literature, and I started my interest in research there. You know, I entered college as a pre-med, you know, which for those of you who are interested in going into medicine, really all you have to do is take 4 year-long classes, right? There's chemistry, organic chemistry, biology, and physics. Each of those has a lab component, and then you can major in anything you want. You can major in basket weaving or, you know, whatever, and you all just only have to take those 4 classes, and then you take an exam at the end of the 4 years called the Medical College Admission Test, which is the MCAT. Maybe you've heard that exam. It's kind of a big exam. It's an exam that if you don't do well in, you won't be a doctor. Like there are many exams you take to be a doctor. This is the one where you really have to do well, otherwise the process won't move forward. And you have to get pretty good grades and so on. And so I studied a lot in undergrad and studied neuroscience, and I did research in neuroscience. I studied the visual system. I studied how this part in the back of our brain called the occipital lobe, how it develops and how it, brain cells form connections with each other called synapses, and the role of different neurotransmitter systems in that. And I used electron microscopes to look at tiny little structures in the brain and how they wired up to each other, and how that changed over the course of development as I was studying rats, and I looked at how when they start to see how those connections changed in the brain. After that, I took, actually 3 years after I graduated from college, I spent working full-time as a research assistant at this place called the Rockefeller University. It's a very interesting place for those who are interested in just in general biomedical sciences. It's one of the premier biomedical research institutes in the world, really. There's about 7 or 8 Nobel Prize winners on the faculty there, and there's neuroscience, molecular biology, genetics. And it's in New York City. It's right next to Cornell University Medical Center. So I went there and I worked with a guy who was a research assistant who was studying the way that songbirds sing and perceive vocal communication signals. So when birds call out to each other, they recognize calls. Male birds can tell that there's a female bird versus a male bird. And there's a part of their brain, again, that is responsible for that discrimination between different kinds of signals. And so I used things like little electrodes that I would put in the brains of these little birds. So this also brings up the question of animal research, right? And what goes on in biomedical research. It's important, again, ethical, philosophical question. And so I did animal research, and I would subject these birds to these experiments, and very interesting things, listening to their neurons respond to different songs and calls, and seeing how that related to how they behaved in response to those songs and calls. So I did that for about 3 years, and then I finally ended up going to medical school, where I attended the University of Iowa, and I entered what was called the Medical Scientist Training Program there, which is an NIH-funded program that exists in about 33 out of the 150 medical schools in the country, where the federal government, through a grant, pays the medical school to essentially have students who are doing combined MD and PhD degrees. So to be a doctor, you really just need an MD, and to be a scientist, you generally need a PhD. And so there's some doctors who do both. And so I got both degrees there. I spent about 8.5 years in Iowa City, Iowa. Great place, by the way, if anybody here from the Midwest? Great, all right. You're not from Iowa, are you? Okay, where from? Okay, well, so yes, Chicago was the nearby big city. And so I lived there for a while, and that's where I kind of developed my research interest in addiction. I worked with this person named Antonio Damasio, who is a neurologist, and he is a person who is known for studying how different kinds of brain damage affects human behavior. So whereas before I was studying rats and birds and looking at how in, say, a bird, if I, knocked out this one part of the brain by, lesioning it or something like that, how it would affect behavior. Now I was in a situation where I was able to study people who had had strokes, right? Does everybody know what a stroke is? Yeah? So, or traumatic brain injury, right? So these are different kinds of brain injury that can occur. Stroke is one kind of brain injury that is very common. You can think about it as like a heart attack in the brain, right? It's a brain attack, right? So every important part of your body, actually every part of your body, important or not, has a blood supply. And when that blood supply gets blocked through a cholesterol blockage or a blood vessel breaks or something like that happens, then that part of the brain, it dies and it never comes back, right? So the brain, unlike other tissues in the body, is a non-regenerating tissue that once it loses a part of its function through some sort of what we call ischemia, which is a lack of blood flow, then it doesn't ever really return, right? The cells there don't regenerate and come back like they would in your muscle or in your skin or in your gastrointestinal system. So people get these strokes, and they get them in very interesting parts of the brain that we're interested in studying. And so Antonio Damasio has been interested in studying things like language, memory, emotions, decision-making, by looking at different parts of the brain that have specific roles to play in those functions and seeing what happens, right? So if you thought a part of the brain was important for, the ability to recognize animals and name them, right? What do you think would happen if you had a stroke in that part of the brain? Anyone? It would be hard to do, right? You would have a deficit in that ability. So we use this technique of what's called the lesion method to understand the relationship between brain structure and function, right? And we were studying the function of relatively large areas of the brain and relatively complex kinds of cognitive functioning, okay? So what I decided to do was to apply that method, that way of studying things, to the question of addiction, right? So up until that point, there has been a lot of work in animals, right? So mostly in rats and mice, looking at the question of what parts of the brain are responsible for addiction, right? So, you know, addiction is a very common disorder. We call it a disorder because we think of it as an abnormal behavior. It's something that causes people significant dysfunction in their lives. It can kill people. It can destroy families. And there's a spectrum from sort of controlled use all the way down to addiction. And so we're very much interested in that line between those two, right? And which people are vulnerable to being more in the addicted side than the controlled side. And so a lot of work had gone on in animal models looking at this question of what brain systems are involved in addiction. And they focused on this neurotransmitter in the brain, this particular chemical in the brain called dopamine. Have you all heard of dopamine? Yes? Yeah, it's a very kind of, it's almost become a part of the popular parlance, right? People talk about dopamine as being the pleasure molecule, and so there are parts of the brain that release dopamine, and when people take drugs, or they have sex, or they eat delicious foods, or things like that, it releases dopamine in other parts of the brain that are involved in motivating behavior and causing the experience of pleasure. So drugs of abuse, like cocaine, alcohol, heroin, and nicotine, all cause the release of dopamine in particular parts of the brain, called, you know, there's areas like the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, so these are the sort of reward system. The dopamine goes into these places, causes a feeling of pleasure, but also there's also what we might consider a very profound kind of set of changes that go on in these parts of the brain that are related to learning, right? So addiction is really a set of learned behaviors, right? It's not there before you ever try a drug or do anything, but if you do it long enough, your brain actually learns to want these things, right? And it wants it more and more as time goes on. So that had been studied a lot in animals, and they had also started looking at addiction in people directly by putting people into what are called brain imaging machines, right? So they take things like a magnetic resonance imaging scanner or a positron emission tomography scanner. These are big, long words to describe basically machines that they have like a big thing here and a hole here, and you kind of slide the person in and their head is in the hole. You're not hurting the person, you're just putting them in there. And these machines allow you to measure brain activity while the person is alive and thinking and feeling and behaving. The person has to stay pretty still, but what that has allowed us to do is say, well, when we show somebody who's addicted to cocaine or alcohol or nicotine, their drug of choice, we show them videos of somebody else using, or we show them, ashtrays or, bottles of vodka, whatever they seem to want, they start to crave the drug, and then we see how their brain actually lights up when they're craving the drug. So we're looking at the neural correlates, as we call it, of drug craving. And so people have been doing that work, and they've found that there's a whole different network of brain areas, some found in animals, but also some new areas that are special for people. So areas like the prefrontal cortex are involved, and a particular part of the brain called the insula, which is an area of the brain that I became very interested in. This part of the brain is interesting because it seems to play a role in how we feel emotions, right? So when we feel angry, when we feel sad, when we feel love, when we feel hate, this part of the brain seems to be always active in those situations. This is a part of the brain that also seems to be very interested in what's happening in your guts, right? So in your stomach, in your liver, in the reproductive organs, inside the immune system, inside your lungs and your heart, that these are all parts of your body that actually have sensations, right? When you feel with your heart, right, that's a kind of an expression that exists in, for a long time, right? That actually has some relationship to how your brain actually comes up with feelings. It actually seems to know what's going on in your body when you feel emotions, and that's actually what gives rise to the feeling of the emotion. So that was the kind of the theory at the time. So this insula kept lining up again and again in these brain imaging studies, and people really weren't that interested in it up until the time I was studying it. But I was really interested in questions like, well, what is a craving? What does it feel like when somebody's craving? And I was interested in nicotine, so I studied tobacco. I studied it because it was and it is, it's the most commonly abused substance. I'm sure people in this room smoke. I know that was the case when I was a student here. It's a highly addictive substance, and so it's something that is very commonly abused. It's also the substance that actually kills more people than anything else. We don't tend to think about it like that because it's not illegal. It's not something that people get into car accidents because they're smoking or get divorced or whatever. But it's something that causes cancer and heart disease and things like that. So as a public health question, it actually was a very interesting and pressing substance to study, right? So even though cocaine is very addictive and is illegal and all these things, nicotine to me was more interesting because it actually had more of a public health impact. So it was easier to study smokers too because there are more of them and they tend to get strokes. That's the other problem with nicotine. You smoke enough cigarettes, you'll increase your risk of heart disease, diabetes, and stroke, right? So here we had a group of people who were smokers and they had brain damage in a part of the brain called the insula, right? And so I found a bunch of these people. And so I had a question, which is, well, if this insula lights up again and again and again in these brain imaging studies, and we think it's important for addiction, what happens when you get a stroke there? Who would predict what's going to happen? Anyone? Yeah. Okay, you can't handle your emotions, so that actually is something that can happen with insula damage too. How about with respect to smoking specifically? Yeah. Okay, so that would be an effect of the brain damage. That could happen too, yeah? You lose the addiction, exactly. So that is, all the things you guys are saying are correct, but the thing that I think was the question that's particularly relevant to addiction is that if this part of the brain is important for addiction and you lose it, right, then you might hypothesize that you lose the addiction. So that was my hypothesis, right? I said, well, let me ask that question. And this is how we do science. We have a set of background research that other people have done that leads us to say, well, maybe this is true. And then we say, well, let's do an experiment. And this was an experiment that relied on people having strokes in this part of the brain. So I took a bunch of people who had, who were smoking and had strokes in that part of the brain. And I took a bunch of people who were smoking and had strokes in other parts of the brain, right? Because I needed what we call a control group, right? Because for all we know, people stop smoking because, well, I had a stroke, doc, and I don't want to smoke anymore because it's bad for you, right? So a lot of people will stop smoking after they have a stroke. So we compared the people with insula damage to this other group, this control group, and we found that actually the insula damaged people and the other people, as might be expected, they didn't necessarily quit more frequently than the insula damage. The insula damaged people were quitting, and the control group were quitting too. So we then looked at questions to ask these people, and we asked them things like, well, how easy was it to quit smoking? And oops, and did you want to smoke again afterwards? Did you ever relapse after you quit? How quickly did you stop? And what we found is that the people with the insula damage were quitting very easily. They didn't have urges to smoke after they stopped, and they never started again, compared to the people with the other brain damage who quit, but found that it was quite difficult and relapsed multiple times and had all sorts of issues. So it did seem that the insula damage, disrupted the addiction to smoking, right? So that was the title of the paper I wrote in 2007, in January of 2007, in the journal called Science, which is a nice journal to publish in if any of you ever end up being scientists. And so that was sort of the big research finding that came out of my Ph.D. work. And I did some other work where I looked at how the pleasure from smoking is related to the taste of tobacco and the taste of nicotine and things like that. Because the idea was that this insula, which is again a part of the brain that is interested in your heart, your lungs, your taste system, right, has something to do with how you remember the taste and feel of tobacco, right? That craving has something to do with your body and how your body felt when you used a drug, right? Just like wanting, like when you're hungry for a specific food, like, oh, you really want cheesecake, you know, you'll do anything for that piece of cheesecake. Your brain is thinking about, well, that cheesecake it tasted a certain way. When it went on my tongue, when it went down my throat, when it was in my stomach, it had a certain bodily effect on me, right? So it turns out that all drugs of abuse, right, any, you know, nicotine, heroin, alcohol, tobacco, whatever, they all do things to your body, right? Like when you smoke, you take a puff and it hurts. If anybody's ever smoked, you know that that first cigarette, it's extremely painful, and that becomes a source of pleasure over time, that painful sensation. So I was interested in looking at that sensation and how it was represented in the brain, and so I continue to sort of be interested in that, and I'm sort of trying to develop a set of research questions about that. So anyway, that was my PhD work. After that, I completed medical school, and pretty much from the beginning of medical school, I knew that I was interested in psychiatry. So do you all know what psychiatry is? Does anybody anybody who knows what a psychiatrist does, or? Okay, I'll explain it. Some mumblings are going on here. Does somebody want to raise their hand and say, or? Yeah, go ahead.
Psychiatrists listen to your problems. You tell them things and they say, you're angry. You say, I'm not angry. You say, you're angry. You say, I'm not angry. You say, you're angry. And then you try to figure out why you're angry.
Okay, very good. No, I think that's a really interesting view of psychiatry, and it's correct, actually. So psychiatry is the medical specialty, right, that deals with the mind and brain, right? So problems related to emotion and feeling, behavior, and addictions, things like that, anxiety, depression, psychosis, right? So people who are hearing voices and who are believing things that are out of touch with reality, people with eating disorders, people who cut themselves, people who are suicidal, right? These are, problems that psychiatrists treat, right? So these particular issues are psychiatric problems. Now, psychiatrists are medical doctors, so we treat people with these problems in a couple of different ways, right? One is using medications, and that's been an aspect of psychiatry that has emerged over the last, 60 years or so as medications have become available to treat things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and even addictions. And they're very commonly prescribed. And there's all sorts of interesting and contentious debates about what psychiatric medications do for people, whether they're overprescribed, whether they're underprescribed, whether the right people are getting them, who's prescribing them, whether they are trying to solve problems that can't be solved by medications, right? So that's a whole other set of questions that we can talk about. But the other part of psychiatry, which is unfortunately fallen out of favor as medicines have become more the focus of psychiatry, is psychotherapy, right? And that's kind of what you're talking about. And there's still a few psychiatrists, and I would include myself in that group, who focus on talking to their patients as a way to help them solve their problems, right? So there's actually pretty good scientific evidence that if you meet with a psychiatrist once a week and you're depressed or anxious, and a psychologist, and I'll tell you what the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist is, but in any case, somebody who is a therapist, who can either be a psychiatrist or psychologist, you meet with them once a week for 45 minutes, and you go through a specific set of goals and exercises related to your mood or anxiety, that actually you can improve that just as well as you can from a medication, right? Now, if it's a severe form of anxiety or depression, or you're hearing voices because you're so anxious or depressed, or you want to kill yourself because you're so anxious and depressed, then you probably need to be on a medication. But the more milder forms of anxiety and depression and other psychiatric problems, talking is actually an extremely helpful thing, and there's good scientific evidence to suggest that. Unfortunately, the current scheme of how insurance companies and the economy and how that all works, it tends not to promote that as much as the medications, right? So that's another interesting set of questions. So a psychiatrist is somebody who uses both medications and talking to treat problems of thought, feeling, and behavior, okay? So they're medical doctors who are interested in the mind. Psychologists are similar. So there was a time back 100 years ago when psychologists were people who studied the mind. They were scientists, basically, right? So there's a difference between ologist and iatrist. The ending iatry or iatrist means to treat, to help and to treat, right? Ology means to study. So psychologists back in the day were people who studied the mind, who studied behavior, who studied how people perceive and remember and feel emotions and things along those lines. And psychiatrists were people who actually tried to treat those problems arising from, you know, your memory or your feelings and your thoughts, right? Now, as this whole equation changed and psychiatrists became more people who prescribe medications, psychologists then sort of took over some of those roles of the talk therapist and became more they basically took that role over. And so psychologists do a lot of that work and social workers do a lot of that work. So if you guys are interested in, you know, helping people through talking, you know, you don't necessarily have to become a psychiatrist, although that would be a great way to do that. You can also become a clinical psychologist or a social worker, right? And those are different. And I often work with social workers and clinical psychologists. Sometimes they're doing this therapy, and I'm prescribing medications for patients. And sometimes I'm doing it all, right? And it just sort of depends on what the particular person is interested in. So, and when we do psychotherapy, we are interested in anger, you know, because anger motivates a lot of behavior. Fear motivates a lot of behavior, right? And so there are things that people do and that are based upon motivations that they may not necessarily be aware of, right? So if a psychiatrist says something like, well, you're angry, and you say, no, I'm not, it may be because you're not actually angry, okay? But it may also be because you are angry, but that you have a defense. You have something in your mind that keeps you from experiencing that emotion consciously, but it nonetheless is driving your behavior, right? So if you show up for your appointment 15 minutes late every time, and there's always some different excuse for it, and the doctor's sitting there and he's feeling angry at you, right? Then he might ask you the question of, you know, maybe you're angry at me, and that's why you're showing up 15 minutes late every time. And you'll say, no, I'm not, and he'll say, yes, you are. But it might actually be that there is an anger there, and by uncovering that anger, right, you may have some relief from the symptoms. Your behavior of showing up 15 minutes late for your session every week and showing up 15 minutes late for class every week may actually become improved through uncovering the role that anger plays in your behavior, right? So that's a particular kind of talk therapy, right? It's one kind of talk therapy, what we call psychodynamic psychotherapy, which deals with the unconscious mind and conflicts in the unconscious mind. And that was something that was pioneered by this guy that you probably heard of named Sigmund Freud, right? So he was interested in things like the unconscious mind and aggression and anger and how that motivates people's behavior. He talked a lot about sex and a lot of interesting things there too. So very interesting guy. Hopefully you all have a chance to read him in high school and college, even if you never study psychology or psychiatry, because his work pervades the entire kind of canon of Western literature, you know, literary criticism, you know, every film that you see and sort of how it's sort of, you know, it's just in the grain of our society. Whether you are a psychologist or a psychiatrist or not, it's very important, I think, to understand at a basic level what Sigmund Freud did. A lot of people feel that he is kind of out of fashion, that he was wrong. He had certain ideas that some people would consider sexist, racist perhaps even too. But nonetheless, he was a brilliant thinker and was the first person to consider that our behavior might be motivated by things that we are not fully aware of, right? It's something that probably seems obvious to a lot of people here because we all grew up in this particular culture where Sigmund Freud was, you know, part of the foundation of our culture, but you know, that wasn't an obvious thing, you know, 200 years ago, right? So he's somebody who, when you go to college, you will likely have exposure to him in one form or another. And it's just interesting to know that there's a form of psychotherapy that is still based on his ideas that is actually still quite prevalent and actually is the kind of foundation of modern psychiatry, even though it's kind of fallen out of favor as a primary treatment. All psychiatrists talk about defense mechanisms and, you know, anger and aggression and conflict and, you know, the the superego and these kinds of terms that Sigmund Freud came up with. So, so psychiatry is a way to treat problems of the mind, problems of thought, problems of feeling and of behavior. Now, there are different subspecialties within psychiatry. So people can specialize in child and adolescent psychiatry, right? So even kids have psychiatric problems, adolescents have psychiatric problems. Again, depression and anxiety, will often begin in the teenage years, 15, 14, 16, 17. So you guys are in that age range where a lot of these things show up for the first time. And so child and adolescent psychiatry is a specialty that works with, people, younger people. There are geriatric psychiatrists, people who work with older individuals, okay? There are forensic psychiatrists, who are psychiatrists who work at the interface between psychiatry and the legal system, right? So you've heard of the insanity defense, many of you, where you get accused of a crime and it was because you heard voices telling you to do the crime that you did it, right? So it turns out that actually, if that's really true and you were psychotic at the time of committing a crime, that you can be called not guilty by means of insanity, right? So you were mentally ill at the time that you committed the crime, and that caused you to do that, and so you're held sort of not accountable for your behavior in that situation, but you end up having to get treated, and that's mandated by the court, and you end up being hospitalized, and you have to spend months, maybe even years in the psychiatric hospital until you're treated, and then you can be released back into society, right? So forensic psychiatrists are involved in evaluating people like that. So you're the lawyer who's defending your client who's accused of a crime, and he says he was psychotic at the time, and so, or somebody thinks so, or the judge thinks so, and so you get hired to basically say, I'm going to evaluate this person and provide an objective assessment of whether this person is or was psychotic at the time, and you provide an opinion to the court, right? So you're working not as this person's doctor, but you're working for the court, and it's a very interesting role. So those are forensic psychiatrists. And then there's addiction psychiatrists, right? And so that is something that I'm an addiction psychiatrist. In fact, I'm still in my training. I'm sort of ashamed to say it. I'm still at this age, and I'm in a fellowship for addiction psychiatry at Columbia University. And what I'm doing there is I'm learning more about how to treat addictions using, again, medications, but also talking to people, right? So, and addictions are interesting because they're among the few psychiatric disorders where there's evidence that the talk therapy works quite a bit better than the medications. And treatments for addiction involve things like teaching people coping skills for managing negative emotions, right? So one of the things that drives people back to drugs and alcohol is that they have feelings like anger or fear or sadness, where they, instead of coping with those feelings in a healthy way, they'll turn to alcohol or drugs to try to manage those feelings. And so one of the things that we do is to try to essentially help people to develop better, more adaptive coping skills to avoid that, and ways to, when they crave drugs and alcohol, to help to control that craving. And that's actually the focus of my current research. So right now I am doing a research project where I'm working with two people. One of the people is a clinical psychologist who's an alcohol researcher who studies psychotherapies and essentially which psychotherapies work and why they work, right? And so he and I are collaborating with a cognitive neuroscientist. So one of these people who puts people in the brain scanner and takes pictures of their brain when they're doing things, thinking and feeling. And that person's expertise is in studying what's called emotion regulation, right? So emotion regulation is a process wherein people who are, and we all do it, right? Because, for example, we may be angry. I keep using your example of being angry, but it's a good one, where if we feel a certain emotion that may not be appropriate for the time and place where we are, right, we control it in some way, right? So if somebody makes us angry and we're sitting here in the lecture, we don't just get up and beat up on the person, or we don't yell at them. We do something to get rid of that feeling, right? So we may think about something else. We may just try to fall asleep. We may decide to look at that person and try to explain their behavior in some other way that doesn't make us so angry, right? So we may reinterpret or reappraise that situation, right? So these are all strategies that we use to regulate our emotions, right? So we have an emotion that's kind of coming up that we don't really have control over, that just comes out of what the person from something outside of us. And then there's the strategies that we use to kind of tamp down on those emotions, right? So there's the drive, there's the gas pedal for emotions, and then there's the brakes. And so what we're studying is that interaction that leads to the regulation between the gas and the brakes. And addiction is very much the same way, right? So cravings, there's like a gas pedal for cravings, right? And we've studied that quite well when we've found that areas like the insula are important for that gas pedal. The amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the dopamine system, these are parts of the brain that are involved in the gas pedal, right? And now what we're looking at is how the brake system, a system called the prefrontal cortex, can sort of connect to that gas pedal and essentially, cause it to slow down. So we're looking at this interaction when people crave. So what we're doing is we're saying, well, now you are somebody who has a problem with alcohol, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to regulate your craving. And I'm going to say to you, when you see this cue that makes you want to drink, think about, I'm going to show it in two conditions. One, just, look at it and think about it in ways, think about all the good, nice things that it'll do, how it makes you feel, how tasty it'll be, right? How it'll make you relax and all these things. That's one condition. The other condition is I'm going to have you think about all of the bad and negative things that this is going to do to you if you do it repeatedly, right? Sort of the negative consequences. And so what we're finding so far is that actually if you have people think about negative consequences of alcohol use, that it actually reduces their level of craving, which makes sense, right? So that's one coping strategy, one regulation strategy that we find works for people. And in fact, that's a component of cognitive behavior therapy for alcohol dependence. And so we're putting people in the brain scanner to see what happens when they engage in that process, when they think about negative consequences, when they reduce their urges to drink, and how does that sort of cut down on the urges. So, and those are ongoing experiments, but we expect that there will be more activity in the prefrontal cortex areas when people are doing that regulation, and there'll be less activity in these gas pedal areas, the amygdala, insula, nucleus accumbens, dopamine system. And so that's, yes?
I was just going to tell you that we only have about 6 minutes.
In fact, I am just wrapping up. So this is getting to what I'm doing right now. So that's where my kind of career has come to. Now, I know that you guys have been looking at or been hearing about PTSD and traumatic brain injury. These are very interesting things because they have also brain correlates too. The same brain systems that are involved in addiction, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the insula, these also play a role in PTSD, right? So PTSD is a learned behavior essentially that, if you don't have a trauma, you don't have PTSD. There's something that happens in the brain where you form an association between the traumatic event and the feeling that you have, and it basically kind of wires up in a way that's not that different from addiction. Turns out a lot of people who have PTSD have problems with addictions. There's a lot of what we call comorbidity, and that traumatic brain injury is something that can complicate addiction and PTSD. So people who have all three, they have a lot of problems, and that there's a lot of interesting research going on to try to understand how we can best help those people. So I guess we can leave some time for some questions, see if you guys have anything in particular that is interesting. Yes?
You're saying that, I think it was the word they used was insulin lights up in the brain?
The insula, yeah.
Insula?
Mm-hmm.
Does the same insula light up for smoking as it would for something like chewing tobacco?
That's an interesting question. It lights up for smoking, it lights up for heroin, it lights up for alcohol, it lights up for cocaine. We don't know about chewing tobacco yet because it has not been directly studied. I would bet, I would say give it a 99% probability that it would, because it's an addictive substance and it's tobacco, right? So I'm going to say yes, even although it's a speculation. All right? Yeah.
true that like, if you suppress certain emotions like anger, fear, or sadness, that can physically harm you?
That's
like not doing it yourself?
right, right. That's a really interesting question. Suppression of emotions comes at a cost, right? Now, suppression is only one kind of emotion regulation strategy, right? So if you are feeling a strong emotion and you just essentially say, I'm not going to feel it, right? And you don't engage in like a strategy like trying to think of the situation in a different way or try to get out of the situation or solve the problem, that can have health consequences. It creates more load on the cardiovascular system, for example, and it can have down the road, if your personality style involves suppression of emotion, especially negative emotions like anger, then it can lead to problems down the road, but perhaps more like health problems. More importantly, though, is those anger doesn't go away, right? If you suppress it, it's still there, and it will tend to come out in ways that are less than adaptive, right? Because again, that unconscious thing comes up where you could have dealt with it consciously, but you didn't, and so it's now going to bubble up in situations where somebody says something that is maybe not so quite right, and then you lash out at them, and it's like what's going on? Why is this person so angry at me? It might be because of the thing that made you angry before, right? So it may have consequences for your behavior down the road that aren't going to be so helpful. So addressing anger when it happens is always a good idea, in a non-violent way. Yes.
Addiction just be limited to drugs, or are there certain behaviors that classify as addiction?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. This is another area of contention and controversy. There's there's a manual of psychiatric disorders where they essentially list all of these disorders and categorize them. And the new version is coming out next year. And one of the debates they're having is should they include what are called behavioral addictions in that, and in particular things like gambling addiction. There's internet addiction. Some people talk about sex addiction. These are things that probably engage similar brain areas, like the insula, like the nucleus accumbens, like the dopamine system, but that don't involve chemical, effects. They can be as problematic as drug addictions, right? So, in my mind, something is an addiction, and it is a disorder if it causes problems, right? So, if your gambling habit is out of control, and you are spending all of your family's money on gambling, or not doing your schoolwork, and things become a problem for you, then that's more important than what happens in your insula and nucleus accumbens. From the perspective of a psychiatrist, right? It's a problem and should be addressed by a psychiatrist if it's causing problems in your life, right? If it's not, then maybe it's not an addiction, right? So. Now that may sound like, well, it's okay to gamble as long as you don't get addicted, right? But that's not the message, though. The message is that everybody is at risk of becoming addicted to these things. They are set up to be sort of addicted. Some people are vulnerable, some people are not. Do you want to roll the dice, right? Yeah.
Why is it that, most of the time when someone is addicted to something, they'll think or convince themselves that they're not addicted to it, that they don't need it, and then they won't accept the fact that they need help until it's the worst possible situation.
Right. So you're talking about a couple of things, very important clinical aspects of addiction. One is denial, right, and the other one is insight. It's the lack of insight, right? So denial is where, you're basically saying that you kind of know at some level that there's a problem, but you're sort of denying it to other people around you, and you're saying, well, no, it's fine, but you sort of have an idea to yourself. And lack of insight is just not knowing that there's a problem, right? And so that's one of the fundamental issues with addiction, is that people deny it, they hide it, right? Sometimes it's just that people are hiding it. Addiction is it's a shameful thing for many people, right? Nobody wants to be addicted. Nobody wants to be called addicted to anything. So people spend a lot of time and effort who are addicted hiding their addiction from other people. And so that may come across as, sort of denial, or I don't really have a problem, whereas it's just like, well, they may know that they're addicted, but they just don't want other people to know about it. But for a lot of people, though, the addiction is going on, it's raging, and they have no idea that it's there, right? Because there's nothing obvious that's saying, oh, I'm addicted, right? other people can see it around them, right? But part of it is, you know, if they're like intoxicated on alcohol all the time or high on cocaine, it's hard to perceive the emotional and social cues that generally are telling other people that you have a problem, right? Because they're impaired. Yeah, go ahead.
Also, like, can one addiction like lead to, like, let's say like someone was a coke addict,
Mm-hmm.
they recovered from it fully and everything, but like,
Mm-hmm.
let's say that they started drinking or smoking,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, or what have you, like, would that reset that other addiction and make them want that again because it's another substance?
Yeah, there is some idea that that's true. So there's kind of what we call kind of a cross-sensitization of different drugs. So, you know, people tend to do things like drink and smoke at the same time, or when you know, I only use cocaine when I drink, and these are the sort of things that often happen. So those things are associated with each other. So if people stop one but then don't stop the other one, it will increase the risk of relapsing to the other drug.
What if it's something completely different?
Even if it's something completely, you know, usually they tend to go together. There's a rare person who only does one drug and then only they do the other one when they're not on the other one. People tend to use them together. But there is, you bring up an interesting a neuroscience point, which is that now there's research going on, actually in the lab of this guy named Eric Kandel, who's one of the big memory researchers, Nobel Prize winner. He's actually at Columbia University. And he's doing work that looks at this idea of the gateway hypothesis, right? This idea that nicotine is seemingly sort of okay thing to do. You know, a lot of people start it, you know, in adolescence, that it can actually lead to use of harder drugs like alcohol and marijuana and then ultimately cocaine. And that he is showing through very interesting work at the genetic level that there's effects that nicotine has on the structure of the genes that predisposes people to become addicted to alcohol, cocaine, and harder drugs, right? So it's not just that the people who smoke are the ones who are, you know, more likely to do risky and impulsive things in general, and therefore they end up doing cocaine and alcohol. There's something about nicotine itself that's changing the brain and making it more susceptible to becoming addicted to other drugs, right? And it's a really interesting idea because it's kind of what we see, right, is that people who are smokers, they tend to be the ones who end up going down the road to using other drugs, and that's why it's called a sort of a gateway. Same with marijuana. Marijuana is kind of considered to be something that opens the road for other drugs down the road, right? Now that can sound a lot like, oh, you know, if you start smoking cigarettes, you know, you're going to become a drug addict, and so, you know, because it's sort of a moralistic kind of a thing, but actually there's good brain evidence to suggest that that's what's going on. So I don't know if that answers your question. Any other questions? Okay.